active measures, psychological warfare, ideological subversion, fifth generational warfare, the sixth domain of war. Since the beginning of mankind, we have engaged in conflict for territory and resource. Some of the first tools and technologies we have developed were for war. And to this day, our most advanced tools and technologies are for war. Sure, it matters who's got the biggest stick, but it matters a hell of a lot more who's swinging it. Our strategies and tactics have evolved just as the tools have over the ages. And in the age of information, information itself is a weapon. Having the biggest stick is one thing, knowing how to swing it better is another. But what if you could win the conflict without ever having to pick up your stick? I am Final Synapse, and in this series, we dive into the history of disinformation and political warfare. It is a subject you can only begin to understand by taking a step back and seeing the bigger picture. History repeats itself, and by learning the examples you can begin to understand what is happening today. Follow me and see how deep the rabbit hole goes. Grover A. Whalen, New York's Commissioner of Police from 1928 to 1930. Tough yet pompous, known as a ruthless enforcer of the law, modernized and grew the NYPD, adding men and arms, deploying squads to stamp out organized crime, trashing speakeasies and breaking up communist demonstrations by force. There is plenty of law at the end of the nightstick, was one of his infamous lines. October 1929, the New York Stock Exchange crashes. Industrialized nations spiral into the Great Depression. 3.7 million workers are unemployed in America. March 6, 1930, Worldwide Unemployment Day, where workers clash with authorities across the Western world. Police used tear gas in front of the White House. 75,000 had gathered in Union Square in Manhattan, New York, where the most brutal police reaction was to be seen. Mounted police troop units trampled over demonstrators who fell to the ground. Rumors began circulating that Whalen would step down, but he denied these, and on April 26 led a parade of 6,000 men down Fifth Avenue. 4 days later, he unleashed an immense show of police force to counter the May Day demonstration of about 25,000 communists. May 2nd, the police commissioner drops a bombshell on the media. They'd uncovered, using radical squads led by Inspector John Lyons, the hidden hand behind the communist riots. Lyons and his men believed that communism simply represented organized violence and should be outlawed as an insurgent force. Whalen told reporters, after a strenuous and painstaking investigation, the NYPD has come to the conclusion that the Communist Internationalist of Moscow was directly operating in the United States through certain agencies having headquarters in the city of New York, fomenting strikes and riots. He accused Armtrog, which was an official Soviet trading organization, of being a den of spies. This was quite bold, but not without precedence. 3 years earlier, Scotland Yard uncovered a similar activity by raiding Arcos Limited, a Soviet commercial entity similar to Armtrog. 7 weeks prior, Berlin confronted Soviet envoy over subvertic activity whipped up by the Comintern. Whalen needs to provide solid evidence of these accusations. The NYPD had seized 6 letters, 5 from A. Fedorov, a Comintern leader, and the 6th a response from Armtrog, signed by their secretary and treasurer T.G. Harpfen. Written in Russian, they talk about Moscow exploiting the approaching economic crisis, i.e. the Great Depression, by kindling strikes and riots in the United States of America. Graffen's letter listed 30 agents allegedly dispatched from Moscow to New York. The documents presented were a perfect smoking gun. Whalen, under political pressure for results, failed to see that it was too good to be true. The same day, Armtrog responded that the documents were forgeries. Peter Bogdanov wrote to Whalen demanding a thorough investigation, screwily pointing out that they had facilitated $1.5 million in trade. The New York Times, in its first story on this, cited a list of inconsistencies in the 6 documents, including misuse of Russian official titles, misspelling of unofficial Soviet ambassador's name, and an incorrect address. The New York Times quoted several critics in its piece. Whalen stood firm, responding with denial when accused. 3 days later, Izvestia, official outlet of the Central Committee in Moscow, accused Whalen of being an adventurer and his activities a public scandal, implying they had forged the documents. Eventually, the metadata would give away the backstory. The story begins 4 months earlier, in fact, in a cluttered, narrow print shop in Manhattan's East Village, ran by Max Wagner, a Russian-born immigrant. The shop had the best selection of Cyrillic type, which were Russian letters, in all of New York. Wagner had been in the typesetting business for 25 years, 18 of which he spent in New York. So, in January 1930, another Russian man enters the shop. He's about 40 years old, 5 feet tall and balding. He wants 3 different types of stationery, completed in 2 stages. First, he wants to see 3 different proofs that he would order 1,000 of each later, one which was an improvised letterhead for Comintern. The next day the man came back and was satisfied with the proof. He didn't notice, or he didn't care, that there were smudges and some of the lettering was faint. This was due to the type being damaged. The man then gave Wagner a small deposit and took his samples and proofs. Wagner kept a single copy of each thing he produced for the man. When the Forward, a Yiddish New York daily, published the documents, Wagner saw them and recognized it as his own work. John Spivak, a journalist from the Evening Graphic, turns up to Wagner's shop a few days later. Wagner retells the story to him. The Evening Graphic then runs the story, also giving advance notice to Piero LaGuardia, member of the House of Representatives for New York's 20th districts and the future mayor. LaGuardia in progress holds up the letterhead declaring, "There is no questions the letters were published in New York and not in Moscow." This triggers a congressional investigation, in June opening the Fish Committee, named after Congressman Hamilton Fish Jr., who was an unflinching anti-communist. Advertising its bias by its very name does serve to illuminate the story further. During one of the hearings in New York, when Spivak was being questioned, the committee learned of the existence of the print shop. They subpoenaed the shop and Wagner testified that afternoon. He explained how he could tell the work was his because of the rare type that was used and the technical errors, such as the faint texts of line 3 and 4, which escaped the customer's attention apparently. They physically took possession of the machine, Wagner even providing the receipt from when he purchased it. Amtrak's legal defense had prepared an extensive list of errors that revealed the document to be forgeries, including mentions of non-existent institutions, erroneous use of official titles, incorrectly named senior officials, consistent misspellings, and wrong addresses. There were 23 errors over 11 typed written pages. The evidence at this point was overwhelming. There could be no doubt that these letters were forgeries. Yet 90 years later, we still do not know who actually produced the forgeries. No historian has uncovered what happened in America's first great disinformation scandal. In the early 1930s, most European countries had recognized the Soviet Union, which was founded in 1922, but the US had not re-established diplomatic relations since the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917. The US was more anti-communist than Europe. Even labor organizations were sharply anti-communist. The American Federation of Labor Vice President Matthew Whalen alleged in 1928 that Amtrak was an intelligence front, more than a year before the Whalen affair. He drew parallels to the case of Arcos, complaining America didn't have a Scotland Yard to get to the bottom of this. Whalen had no evidence. He was part of an influential and well-connected group of anti-communist industrial leaders lobbying hard against America, recognizing the Soviet Union. This high opposition to Marxism was an open door for disinformation and forgery, and with the statement against Amtrak, Whalen was signaling that they were ready to be tricked from the Soviets' point of view. March 4th, 6 weeks after Wagner produced the forged letterheads, Whalen predicted a congressional investigation into Amtrak. Somehow, the AFL knew of incriminating documents circulating in New York. Among the people whom the Fish Committee subpoenaed and interviewed was a former white Russian army officer, whom 2 American journalists alleged had offered them documents providing the Soviets were starting riots in the United States. He offered the documents for the sum of $15,000. The most credible witness, however, was most probably Wagner. He was clearly intimidated by the police investigators and terrified while testifying. Under oath, he testified that the man who originally commissioned the work was called Yasova and worked for Novorossiysk Slovo, which was a pro-monarchist New York-based daily newspaper. Wagner also testified another anti-communist emigre in New York had visited the shop, this time pretending to be one of the officers to be investigating the forgeries. Gregory Bernardatsky, a known anti-red activist who also happened to be the interpreter for the Fish Committee. Wagner testified he let the pretend officers know the name of the man who commissioned the work. Later they returned to let him know that the man had left the country. Wagner stating, "They came back to tell me he went to Europe, and I think one of them was the man there," pointing to Bernatsky. Bernatsky jumps from his chair screaming, "It's a lie! It's a lie!" White-faced and shaking, he refuses to stop after being ordered to calm down. Wagner had revealed too much. But the Fish Committee was ultimately not interested in getting to the bottom of the forgeries. It was set up to investigate malicious communist activities and not malicious anti-communist activities. A month later, Bernardatsky did come forward with new details, stressing that the 6 documents were forgeries, but Soviet ones, stating that Armstrong's response was too quick and too detailed in its rebuttal, implying it was prepared ahead of time. He told the New York Times they forged their own documents so they could claim all the documents were forged in a classic method of denial and distraction, the conspirators accusing the victim of conspiracy. In the Whalen episode, we see how the forensic evidence was remarkably strong, with witness testimony providing a wealth of detail, yet this was not sufficient as the investigation was too ideologically biased, ego-driven and politicized. Whalen himself tried to smear the witness Wagner by bringing up his criminal record. Wagner had been arrested for possessing indecent pictures a couple of years prior. The forgeries also exemplify another lesson. Delayed exposure may be in the interest of the attacker. Whalen's initial documents made front-page news internationally, but then became a cloak and dagger story that inspired reporters and readers' imagination as it continued. The initial forgeries were badly done, but it is highly unlikely that a small group of Russian monarchist emigres designed it to be so quickly discovered. Yet the exposure itself would create a second opportunity to exploit the vision the first created. The forgeries show how active measures of this kind would work for the next century. They articulate a story that the target already believes. In this case, that Armstrong was a den of spies, starting with a basic fact and adding some embellishments as we move along. Armstrong actually did have links to the Soviet intelligence and served the interests of the Soviet revolutionary government. The lies between true and false was far easier to blur when the true and false were as close together as the fingers of a clenched fist. Thanks for watching the video. If you liked it, go ahead and hit the like button. And for more videos like it, hit subscribe. See you next time.